I want the shock and awe factor. Sometimes some fatawa have held us so much back that we don't even know what to do. And it is mentioned in our books of history that on the 23rd of Rabi' al-Awwal, 917 Hijrah, corresponding to around March of 1511 CE, coffee had already spread to Mecca, and a scholar was doing tawaf around the Kaaba, and he saw a group of young men drinking something suspicious and having a good time in the corner of the haram. And he came up to them, and they immediately shut out the lantern and they hid whatever they were drinking. So he challenged them, what is this? And they finally confessed that they were drinking qahwa. So he had them arrested, and he brought them in front of a trial. A group of, I'm not making this up, some of you are looking at me as if, no, I'm not making this up, guys, this is exactly true, okay? And he brought them in front of a group of ulama, and he brought forth the Hanbalis, the Shafi'is, the Malikis, the Hanafis, because in those days, to get a new fatwa, they would bring all of the qudat of the various madhahib. And there was a debate in 917 AH. There was a debate that lasted for the better part of the day, some say even 2 days, where they went back and forth debating whether qahwa was halal or haram. And they brought forth witnesses, they brought forth expert testimony from doctors and from people who had confessed to drinking it. And it appears that eventually the ulama decided that qahwa was an intoxicant. Qahwa was a muskir. And therefore they gave a fatwa that it was haram to drink and sell qahwa, and that anybody who was caught drinking qahwa should be lashed and beaten because he's drinking a muskir. And in fact, some beatings were carried out. And eventually in 950 AH, corresponding to 1544 CE, the Uthmani Sultan, the Uthmani Khalifa, he actually ratified this decree, and he made it the official state position that qahwa is a muskir, it is haram. And then the fatwas began to pour, literally pour, that saying that qahwa was an impermissible drink. And some scholars even said qahwa isn't just haram, qahwa is a bid'ah. Now, where they get this from? And there are a number of stories that are found, Allah knows how true they are, but there are a number of stories found in our literature of that time where a scholar who considered qahwa to be halal invited a group of scholars who considered coffee to be haram. He invited them over to discuss some issue. And he secretly gave them qahwa in the room. And he didn't tell them what it was, because obviously none of them had, tasted qahwa. So he gave them coffee that night. And mashallah, tabarakallah, the discussion that resulted about some fiqhi point was the most exciting discussion they had ever had. And one of them remarked, and the hours flew by, and it was middle of the night, because obviously they're drinking coffee. And one of them remarks, what was this drink you gave us? It really stimulated us to give this deep discussion. And so he told them, this was the qahwa that you guys made haram. Now these stories are found in our tradition, but the fact of the matter is that there was a time when coffee was indeed considered to be haram by the majority, and especially those who were a little bit more conservative. And when I say conservative, I'm not using this as a slur, as a demeaning thing. I'm just saying there are certain scholars, they don't like change. There are certain scholars, they like status quo. That's what I mean by conservative. And these days, of course, people don't even realize that there was a huge controversy over coffee. But the fact of the matter is, the sad fact of the matter, but we need to benefit and learn, is that coffee wasn't the only thing that was made haram in the course of our ummah. The fact of the matter is that a lot of things were considered to be bizarre, strange, haram, bid'ah, against the tradition. And later on they became standard. One of the main reasons the Muslim world was held behind when Europe continued its ascent was that the printing press was banned. Muslims did not print books until 1820s, 1830s. At a time when even the islands of Hawaii had a printing press. No Muslim land had a printing press. Why? One of the reasons being, number one reason, the scholars said it is haram. You cannot, it's going to open up the door for heresy. And we don't talk about these things too much because it is wallahi embarrassing. But it wasn't even the printing press and coffee. The list goes on and on and on throughout our history. Unfortunately, we have some really embarrassing examples. Wallahi, one of the most embarrassing examples, it is so embarrassing that I am embarrassed to mention it, much less give a talk about it. I don't think I'll ever give a talk about it because wallahi, it is embarrassing. But I want you to know because I want the shock and awe factor.
I want the shock and awe factor.
Sometimes some fatwa have held us so much back that we don't even know what to do. And one of the most embarrassing was that when the anti-slavery movement began to spread in Muslim lands in the 1850s, 1890s, 1900s, sadly, some of our scholars stood in the way of anti-slavery movements. And they said it is haram to ban slavery. You cannot ban what Allah has made halal. And there were famous controversies and fatwa about slavery. And do you know that in some Muslim lands, let me just be frank here, in Saudi Arabia, do you know when slavery was banned? Who can tell me when slavery was banned in Saudi Arabia? I wish. 1962. 1962 was when slavery was banned in this great Muslim land otherwise, right? But again, this is an embarrassing episode that our scholars did not understand. Islam does not need slavery. You can ban it and Islam is completely perfect. When the radio was first introduced, pretty much all the scholars said this is haram. And they even said this is sihr, magic. Because how can you have this device and we hear somebody sitting in London, in Timbuktu, in Geneva, and we hear him, on this radio? This must be sihr. And my teachers tell me this, that their teachers told them that when the radio came to Saudi Arabia, they actually, some of them actually went to the transmission towers, they actually went underneath those transmission towers and read Quran, hoping to destroy the sihr of the radio waves. Hoping to destroy that, khalas, there's not going to be any more radio waves and we're going to destroy it. In 1966, the first television tower and broadcasting station of Riyadh, the first television station was stormed by fundamentalist fanatics, and they took it hostage and they demanded that basically no more television be broadcast in Saudi Arabia. I'm quoting you fatwas from 1700s, 1800s, 1920s, 1960s. Let's get controversial and let's get real. Let's get right to 2013. When the news came to the Muslim world that MBC is doing a serial on Umar ibn al-Khattab, fatwa began to pour in from every single respected body, basically in the Sunni world. Al-Azhar, Deoband, Salafis, every single group, the fatwas began pouring in. And amazingly, when the Sunni world can hardly be united over anything, it was as if all of the major bodies were united that the serial is haram, it is a bid'ah to watch, you cannot do this, and they listed a whole bunch of reasons. But just like when the printing press is introduced, wallahi, they're not thinking 2, 3, 5 steps ahead. They're just thinking of the here and now. Now, you know what hurt me the most, and I was opposed to those fatwa from day one. As soon as those fatwas started pouring in, I supported the serials, by the way. I supported this series. Now, you know what hurt me the most? The fact that so many large bodies said these serials are haram. This series is haram. You cannot watch it. You should not broadcast it. They all said this, and yet this series became what? The highest watched, #1 serial in the history of Arab television. Now, what does that show you about the disconnectedness of the masses with their own scholars? What does that show you about how connected our scholars are with the pulse of the ummah? This is what hurt me the most, not the fact that they said it's haram. I respect that opinion. That's a legitimate position to hold. But what does that show you when the status of the scholars becomes so trivial? MBC didn't even care. They didn't even blink an eyelid, and the masses couldn't care either what their own scholars have said. It became the #1 serial in the history of Arab television. Why? Because it is a great series. And the fact of the matter is, no matter how many fatwa you give, you are not going to eliminate the popularity of the soap operas and the dramas and the romance series. No matter how many fatwa you have, you're not going to stop the masses from watching that which is purely haram, pure filth, romance, semi-nudity, music. And you know what? Let's be frank here. Fatwa can be as they are. Now somebody says, are you saying it is halal? I'm saying, who cares what anybody says? Did anybody follow the fatwa that came from the scholars? So one of the jobs of a real murabbi, an alim rabbani, an alim who understands the people, is not to live in a utopia, is not to live in a dreamland and give fatwa to some utopia that doesn't exist. And every criticism that the scholars gave to the serial, every one of them, it has a basis in the Sharia. They're not just inventing it, they're not just pulling it out of their hat, but the fact of the matter is, why am I telling you all of this? Am I wanting you to disrespect the ulama? La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. I seek Allah's refuge from ever hinting at such a matter. But I do want to impress upon you one simple point. Our scholars are humans. And what has happened is that most mainstream movements have solidified their understanding of Islam and their point of reference to be a group of people that do not understand our situation and needs. But the fact of the matter is that our Islam from them cannot be unconditional, because they don't live our lives. They don't understand our situation and scenario. But I'm saying there is always going to be a group that is a little bit more forward thinking, not as pigeonholed into one group and one firqa. You know, another controversy I didn't mention, microphones in the masjid. The entire Muslim world, once upon a time, in the 50s and 60s, some of you might even remember your fathers talking about this, right? When microphones were introduced in the masjids, pretty much everybody said haram, bid'ah was used. Bid'ah. And this isn't just some hardcore Salafi fanatics. These are the Deobandis, the Azharis. This is the mainstream ummah. Because they said, you must hear the human voice. You cannot hear the electronic voice. So microphones are a bid'ah. You tell me what masjid in the world doesn't have a microphone today? The very masjids where these fatwas were given, physically the same masjid, they're using microphones now. Now, look to your scholar and follow that scholar, but you have to do that choosing. Choose a scholar who's living your life, in your land, in your culture and society.
وهذا تخذيل، اللي يقول الكلام هذا تخذيل، ويريد أن يفصلكم عن علمائكم. نعم، فلا تقبلوا من هذا الكلام.